Understanding the complexity of loss of control and flight root causes, the layers of mitigation, and the role of UPRT is really central to being proactive in risk mitigation. Today, our great wish is to give you perspective on the severity and complexity of this needless cause of fatal accidents. Stay tuned. Let's get to it. Hi, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here again with you in this series. We're going to be talking today about safety risk management, or specifically applied loss of control and flight root causes. And I'm excited to have Colonel Jim Hosey is going to be joining me in the Q&A session in just a few minutes. But I want to kick things off with just starting with some general information to set the stage for that Q&A. So right now, before we get started, I really strongly encourage you to get questions ready. As you see something that you're interested in or you'd like to know more, please get those questions in right out of the gate. So we're going to be talking about a lot of aspects of safety risk management. We're going to be founding it a lot on ICAO Doc 9858, the Safety Management Manual, which is really a great resource that I would consider and many would consider to be really foundational to all safety risk management initiatives. So today we're going to talk about that to include hazard identification, safety risk assessment, safety risk mitigation, but really at the end of the day, it's going to be up to you and your team to decide on risk acceptance. So today, be sure you know what you're accepting and what you're doing or not doing really to mitigate this lethal risk. So let's go ahead and jump right in to the slides today. So the overview. We're going to kick it off with how we enable the paradigm shift. This is a topic that we often start these talks with. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. There will be a QR code for you to learn more if you want on another session that's available right now on demand. We're going to take a look at a safety risk matrix. Then we're going to look at the loss of control and flight escalation spectrum, and really stay tuned for that because I think you're really going to enjoy that discussion. Then we will do a risk analysis. Then we're going to look at what the targeted outcomes of mitigating loss of control and flight are to include the competencies that you're evolving and really a holistic level up across your operations as a pilot. Then I'm going to give you an example of some of the licensing training deficiencies before we jump into questions and recommendations. So again, before we get going further, please think about being ready to key in those questions and really get those in queue so we can have a really robust, comprehensive Q&A together with Jim today. All right, so the series overview, this is the third session of 5. If you'd like to see an overview of the entire session, very, very active. We have nearly 100 comments in there. There's the QR code to go to that after the event today, so take a picture of it and have a look at it. Also, the one we did last week was on the power of jet upset training. There's the QR code for that. So please take advantage of those sessions to learn about what's going on in this series, and what's coming up next week is going to be on human factors. So this slide on fatal accidents really is representative of how lethal fatal loss controlled flight accidents are in relation to other accidents that we face in the industry. This particular slide happens to be the air carrier industry, but irrespective of where you look at in fixed wing aviation, the statistics have the same shape very often, if not almost always, loss control and flight dominating those. Now, one thing to think about, and this is kind of hard to accept sometimes, is that this lethality of loss of control in flight really has been established by our existing licensing and rating training processes and methods. Even though we have the very best training in the world, what this spike, what this column is revealing is really a by design deficiency in how we approach this risk. This really is needless, unnecessary. So for the paradigm shift, what we really want to do is we want to take a look at this to address that deficiency that we have in our current licensing and type rating training. And what we're trying to do is push that down where that animated arrow, that different colored arrow, you're going to see it showing up in the presentation here. That's what's indicating the direction we want these to go. So the idea behind it is that we can use readily available resources, and you can see you have aircraft simulation, virtual reality, academics as examples here, to really mitigate this risk comprehensively to generate that paradigm shift. But unfortunately, right now, they are all red because whatever we are doing that's generating this big column is completely unacceptable. We just simply don't want that to be the case. And again, like I said in the kickoff, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you'd like to go more into this and the use of the different platforms, go ahead and have a look at that recurrent session video we did right there. It really goes into that in detail. We're also going to talk more about this in graphic detail in our last session 5 here coming up in a couple weeks. All right, so here is a table 3 from the ICAO Doc 9859, the 2018 version. And what it's showing is a safety risk profile of a theoretical operation or a company. Now, this is representative of the safety risk profile, and the safety risk profile is really designed by the operator. So yours may look exactly like this. It may look different in where the red and orange and green occurs, or you may even have another color or two in there. The point of it is really to show from right to left is increasing severity, and from bottom to top is increasing probability. So ideally what you want to be is you want to be in the bottom right quadrant of low severity and low probability. So understanding and following this process is really central to the risk management role in your organization. And what we find, which is a little bit concerning, is that when many decision makers come and they come through an evaluation at APS, which we invite you to a tour. If you ever make it out here in Arizona, we'd love to show you around. Is that many decision makers are kind of surprised by what we're going to show you in the event today as to where loss of control in flight falls on this theoretical matrix that we're looking at here today. Now, so just as a reminder, we're now going to go through the safety risk management process, and we're going to go ahead and start with hazard identification, which is the first step in that process. Now, this is what I think you're going to find very cool. This is the loss of control in flight escalation spectrum. Before I show it to you, the loss of control in flight escalation spectrum is really a visual representation of the hazard risk outcome mental model to fairly give perspective to you and understanding what the loss of control in flight threat is. So what we can see here, which gets to the title of this presentation today, are the root causes or causes of airplane upsets. They're shown on the left as hazards, because remember, the first step in that process, that safety risk management process, is to identify the hazards and, if you can, eliminate them. Well, interestingly here, we can see the hazards listed on the left side. And going from left to right, we can see the layers of mitigation, awareness, prevention, and recovery. And that funnel in the middle is how the hazard that has an associated risk or outcome of loss of control in flight can propagate from left to right through the layers of mitigation and ultimately end up at this needless, fatal loss of control in flight event on the right side. Now, the source for these causes of airplane upsets that lead to loss of control in flight, is from the Airplane Upset Recovery Training Aid Revision 2 and 3. And they go into great detail as to what those are and explaining those in detail. So I recommend those references if you'd like to learn more. So one of the things to note that when those categories of hazards is that there's 3 main categories. There's environmentally induced airplane upsets, system anomaly induced upsets, and pilot induced upsets. Now together, totaling them together, it really comes together with over 20 known causes of airplane upsets, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, that there's so many hazards that have a risk or a potential outcome of loss of control in flight. Well, why does this matter? Well, number one, very often people don't even consider this when they're thinking about loss of control in flight. And in fact, it's very, very common for training providers and decision makers to simply dismiss it and say, well, if we just eliminate X, let's say, if we can just eliminate distraction or complacency or cross-check issues, then we can eliminate loss of control. It's never going to happen. Now, In the earlier session, I had a saying by H.L. Mencken that was simply this: for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So one of my goals here today is help you to understand how this is a complex threat, and these layers of mitigation are in place by the industry, but there's another layer of mitigation called upset prevention and recovery training that overlays on top of this to not contradict or replace, but to give power and more comprehensiveness and more effectiveness to all these layers of mitigation. Now, let's go ahead and jump in here and have a look at those. You're going to see some of these names that look very familiar. Of course, under awareness, planning, deciding not to go on a flight may be the very mitigation that you need given what the hazards are that you're concerned about facing. Your currency, your flight path awareness, your risk awareness. Under prevention, we can see aeronautical decision-making, risk management, flight path management. Now, a lot of these go across different layers. The point is here is to show you that the industry has a tremendous amount of these layers in place already. As we go into the second order prevention, we can see startle surprise management, and that's a big deal. And we're going to talk more about that next week in human factors. Threat and error management, again, permeates all the layers, and then mitigation and intervention of any level to take early action to mitigate an event from going through the funnel. And we're going to look at that in great detail. Now, in that vertical orange dotted line, we can see the airplane upset. That's a term that's relatively common now. It can also be referred to as loss of airplane state awareness or an undesired aircraft state. The point is now the airplane is in a condition that was unintended, and should it continue, there's going to be an extreme manifestation of a deviation from the intended flight path, which is the definition of loss of control in flight. Now, what that red vertical dotted line means over on the right side, just before the accident, is at some point there's not enough time or altitude for the pilot to be able to avoid the fatal accident. And at that point, it's a foregone conclusion that it's going to be fatal. Now, that does not mean we ever give up. We don't, but we want to be fighting that airplane all the way to the ground. But remember, I need to reiterate, the very best recovery is not being there in the first place. Okay, let's take a look at this red ball. And you can see the red ball now in the hazardous place beside the hazard of auto flight systems. Now, it could be any of them. We could pick anywhere on those hazards. And what the point is that we want to make sure that if we can, do we have to be exposed to the auto-flight systems hazard? So maybe a better way to show that would be, let's think about what hazard on that list on the left could we eliminate. So let's say we have a policy at our organization that we will never go flying if there's a thunderstorm anywhere in the existing environment, or could be for the next 48 hours. We simply won't even walk to the airplane. Well, that may be one situation where we can eliminate the hazard, but just think about it. Attitude, power, cross-check, inattention, complacency, many of these hazards just come part and parcel with operating airplanes that we can't eliminate. We have to understand and mitigate them. And that's what these layers of mitigation are for. So now what ends up happening when you get exposed to a hazard and something is unmitigated, the hazard now manifests itself as a risk. And that risk, represented by the red ball, will propagate from the left side through the funnel all the way over, if unmitigated, into the fatal accident. Now, very often people will say, well, gosh, that's so obvious, that would never, ever happen to me. Well, the reality of it is as pilots, we're mitigating risks all the time. We're executing, implementing all of those layers. And so an airplane upset that makes it through that process can be very insidious or rapid onset, like a wake encounter. The point of it is that it goes through that funnel somehow being unmitigated. And this process you're looking at has established loss of control in flight as the number one threat to air safety, as we saw in that original graphic. So now, what is the role of upset prevention and recovery training? Well, it has three levels to it. It really now is working both ways. It's working to the left in awareness and prevention, and it does work to the right in recovery. But most of the power of recovery training is to more effectively and clearly build the mental model of escalation and how to intervene early in the process. Yes, you do get recovery skills to deal with situations. You do get the discipline to mitigate and overcome human factors such as startle, surprise, and fear. But remember, an effective UPRT program done properly enhances all these layers of mitigation and is additive. It's not contradictory. It's not meant to replace anything. So it should complement your existing training, and an effective UPRT program should be in line with industry standard because there is excellent guidance out by ICAO, the FAA, EASA, and many other national aviation authorities around the world. There is no reason for a UPRT program to be a one-off or somebody teaching you something they learned in the back of a napkin or from their buddy in high school. It needs to be standardized, it needs to be proven, and it needs to be transferable. So, folks, at this point, we're just getting a short pause. If you're liking what you're seeing and you're enjoying this, please like this to get attention and follow us. But also, if you put a comment in at this point, we'd really like that. That really helps us get these videos out to more people, because here at APS is our purpose is that we help pilots bring everyone home safely. And our brand promise is every pilot trained in control all the time. And getting these videos out to more and more pilots helps us do that. So please, anything you can do to help us in that quest, that mission, that calling would be greatly appreciated. And we do have the Q&A coming up very soon. I'm trying to get through this quickly. All right, so here's the risk matrix. Now let's have a look at what loss of control in flight looks like. So as we saw, loss of control in flight is almost always catastrophic, and it tends to live at the probability level of remote, because remote is defined by ICAO as unlikely to occur but possible, has occurred rarely. Well, very often might say, well, it's really improbable. Well, the definition by ICAO of improbable is very unlikely to occur, not known to have occurred, and there's no way we consider that being loss of control in flight, because not only does it occur, it's the most fatal threat that we face in flight operations in any fixed-wing airplane. So the goal is risk mitigation, and the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard, pioneered by APS and released to the industry in 2019, is how you optimize a provider's ability to implement effective upset prevention and recovery training to address both severity, which is usually referred to as recovery, and probability, which is awareness and prevention. And I think Delta Airlines is a great example of that. When it partnered with APS, and over 5 million flights in 5 years, they drove down 50% reduction in the reduction of precursor upset events. Pretty amazing when you think about taking that big red column on the left of the statistics and essentially chopping it in half with a very effective, very intentional program, done well, done properly, attributable to not just the UPRT program, but the really incredible leadership by Captain Brian Sims at Delta Airlines. Is just a fantastic leader and truly a leader in the global airline industry, and effectively implementing effective upset prevention and recovery training to overcome the threat of loss of control in flight. So this is what we're trying to accomplish, folks. And so what that Every Pilot Control and Solution Standard is, EPIC S2 we like to call it, is 5 critical UPRT program implementation factors, plus robust initial training, which is the outer circle, and then timely recurrent training on the inside. So what we want to be doing is having an effective EPIC S2 compliant program. If you want to learn more about that, you can see the URL at the bottom of the page, apstraining.com/epic-S2, is we want the power of an EPIC S2 optimized program to substantially augment the effectiveness of how you are mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight. And it's further empowered if the solution is designed based on what, where, and how you operate, which means a piston program is different than a turboprop program, which is different than a jet program, for example, or a business jet program or an airline program. It really needs to be based around that. So what does this accomplish? Okay, what we're really doing is inserting additional layers of mitigation to a lot of people refer to as the CREM-10, the CRM and the Threat and Error Management, TEM. But also we need to remember that aeronautical decision-making is in there as the fundamental risk mitigation processes that we have as a pilot at our disposal. And what UPRT adds is 3 additional circles that are represented by awareness and prevention and recovery by the 3 circles. Now, the cool thing about upset prevention and recovery training, much like CRM and threat and error management, aeronautical decision-making, is it permeates the entire process. It improves situational awareness, flight envelope awareness, manual handling, manual flight operations proficiency, and decision-making. It further enhances existing competencies. Remember, it's complementary to it and really puts them in afterburner mode or on steroids. That is the goal of an effective program. So what is the overall outcome? What we're trying to do is taking these existing competencies, you can see those bubbles around awareness, prevention, and recovery, and that dotted bubble of loss of control and flight and where it lives by doing an every pilot and controller EPIC S2 compliant program designed around what, where, and how you operate. The goal is to expand your competencies. And again, UPRT adds multiple layers. It addresses both awareness, prevention, and recovery, all the areas that we talked about. So really exciting, folks, to see this. And one great example that I'm going to run through quickly, and we can come back to it in the Q&A, is this attitude indicator here that we'll call it is representative of all 360 degrees of pitch and roll. So 180 degrees to the right, 180 degrees to the left, 90 degrees nose up, 90 degrees nose down. So very quickly, you are a master of your domain at about 4.9% of the envelope. You can see here that inside those parameters, simply 25 degrees nose up, 10 degrees nose down, and less than 45 degrees of bank, you are truly a master and not only operating your airplane there, but keeping it there. The problem is, as you go to the edges of that, there is a buffer, there is a margin of safety around that in your licensing training. And typically it's 30 degrees of pitch, nose up, nose down, and 80 degrees of bank. But the scary part is that's only 11.1% of the all attitude environment. The all attitude environment, all 100%, is nearly 90% of it, 89%, 88.9% of it is not really addressed at all in any intentional way with licensing training. The challenging part is the skills out there in the red area are often counterintuitive, meaning the skills you would use in the green and the orange areas don't effectively transfer into the red area. So what we find is that an airplane upset into the red is an atypical skill and knowledge set that's required. And you can see here, it now is characteristic of having abnormal conditions that are time critical. Cueing is unfamiliar, unexpected. Your skills and your instructional techniques are absent, and the pilot's psychophysiological incapacitation is very, very real. And whenever I talk about this, I always get reminded of that saying by Archilochus 2,500 years ago that's often attributed to Navy SEALs and West Point professors. It simply says this: under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training. And that's what we see every single day at APS. We train hundreds and hundreds of pilots every single month. We have hundreds and hundreds of flights every single week, and we see that pilots don't figure it out when they get into these situations. It is counterintuitive, it is incapacitating, but it requires intentional training. And we believe, and we have seen in accordance with the EPIC S2, every pilot and control solution standard, to really take that pilot in about 3 days to go from being unconsciously incompetent to consciously competent. And that's the scary part, because most pilots show up at APS being convinced that they don't need the training, because we often work business to business instead of one-on-one. After the first day, though, all of that changes. The barriers drop. Everybody becomes open to training. They realize they're going to be well taken care of. There's a lot to learn. And this environment is very safe and very effective. And at the end of the 3-day period, they can't believe they haven't received this training in their careers and why it's not mandatory. Okay, so remember, driving down this needless risk requires intention. It requires a paradigm shift. Hundreds of Fortune 500 flight departments, government agencies, airline pilots, flight schools do this, folks, and it's available today. Seek it out, and you need it. So let's go ahead now and jump into questions. I know Jim is standing by here, but before we do that, I just want to reiterate a couple final points. Loss of control in flight is very often completely unnecessary for all the reasons we've talked about this. Not accepting this risk is really up to you personally, if you're an owner operator, or your team, if you're a safety officer or a chief pilot or a decision maker at a flight department. So just keep in mind that APS and our partners, we're here to help. Please reach out, put the comments into the questions. We really want to help you. We are here as an asset and a resource. So let's go ahead and go to questions now on my good friend, Colonel Jim Hosey. So Jim, you're one of the partners that we've been talking about. So Jim is probably, if not the, one of the most foremost experts when it comes to safety risk management as a safety officer with aviation safety compliance. And Jim, it looks like you're still on mute there if you want to unmute yourself. So while you do that, Jim has a ton of experience from the military, C-130, the C-5 as an instructor as well. And I look here, Jim, and you have your multi-engine land, airplane, single-engine land type rating. You had Part 91, 133, 135 operations. Let's just say that Jim was experienced in nearly every aspect of aviation. So it's great to have you here, Jim. And I know that there's a few things that you wanted to bring up as well. So let me hand it over to you for a few comments here, Jim.
Okay, thanks, BJ, for that introduction. Really appreciate it. For the audience, I'll give you a little more background on my experience. I started out as a second lieutenant in the Air Force in safety. Yes, I was a pilot, but and that's going over 40 years now. It's easy to say, or I always say, I have that SMS or safety tattoo on my back. And I think for any safety folks that are out there, you've developed that. Maybe you only have the S of safety yet because you're developing, you're learning. Maybe you have SAF as part of that tattoo, but as you fully mature, you become a safety subject expert in safety within your department. And you've got that full tattoo on your back of SMS safety. So one of the things I always talk about is a situation that happened to us in my flight department. And it goes back to 2010. And this is how we became involved with APS for UPRT. We were going down to pick up a new Citation 10 at Cessna in Wichita. And I was flying the lead airplane with the pilots that were going to pick up that airplane. And they were going to fly it back once we approved all the maintenance releases, all of the paperwork. So they launched before us. We're en route back to Providence, Rhode Island. And we launched about 5 minutes after that. So we're in trail at 430, and they're ahead of us, and we can see their contrails. But we can also see a thunderstorm that was directly ahead of them and us. So we're talking on common, and I said to that crew, "Are you going to deviate around it, or what's your plan?" And they said, "No, we're going to climb to 45 and top it." Well, unfortunately, they didn't top it. We also climbed to 45, but we're watching the contrail, and all of a sudden the contrail goes like this. It goes back the other way twice, 120 degrees each way. So we deviated around the thunderstorm. We continued on. We talked about controllability, flight controls, check that sort of thing before we proceeded. I asked them if they wanted to divert someplace, and they said, "No, we think we're all set." Our chief of maintenance was on that airplane, not strapped in, and he was thrown around. So that was definitely a hazard, not only to the crew, but to the person in the back. These were general aviation pilots, not used to being upside down in an airplane. So when we arrived back home at our hangar, we went into the conference room. We said, "Okay, what happened? And what can we do to mitigate this?" So we started looking at UPRT providers and settled in on APS. And we decided that we would go through UPRT every 3 years, and that's still continuing. So when we work with a client, whether it's on a consulting basis, we're doing gap analysis, or even safety audits, we talk about a product which is called Safety Risk Profile. Now I'm going to dumb that down a little bit and describe what that is. And there's another product too, which is Safety Performance Indicators. And when those came out by the standards, whether it was FAA or ICAO, everybody said, "All right, what does that mean? We don't quite understand that. So the way I describe it simply for net safety risk profile is, let's say that we're going to start a flight department. We're going to fly 135 charter. We're going to buy an airplane. And before we flip that switch on to go fly that first trip, we're going to sit down and we're going to take a look at all the possible risks that we're facing. And this gets into the risk mitigation and risk assessment. So we're going to do it operationally. We're going to do it human factors wise, address that. Technical issues, maintenance issues. We're going to analyze everything that we're facing in this product. So when I'm working with a client, I bring that up to them, and that's how I describe a safety risk profile. But I'll also say that that is the foundation. That's where your SMS starts. And if you haven't done a risk assessment on all of the things that you're facing, and some of them could be in hangar, slip and fall, fall protection, working alone, all of those things. On the operational side, it may be mountainous terrain. It could be weather. It could be a lot of different things. It could be uncontrolled airports. It may be short runways that you have to go into. It may be places like Eagle, Vail, Aspen, Truckee, but there's many, many places that you have to evaluate as far as airports are concerned. So that those things will go into your safety risk profile. And when I bring up loss of control in flight, I get a deer in the headlights look. And they went, why is that important, Jim? I say, because based on the safety risk, the safety matrix that BJ showed, it's catastrophic if it happens. And it could happen for all of those reasons that he pointed out. And when you look at that bouncing ball all the way to the accident, the incident or accident, James Reason developed the Swiss cheese model. And that's what that is. What barriers are we putting up there to prevent those things, loss of control in flight, from happening? So I get into that, and then it generates a conversation about loss of control in flight, and I point out the documents. So it's ICAO 111, which talks about loss of control in flight. The FAA has their own document, but there's plenty of documentation, guidance out there on loss of control in flight, and pointing out that over 60% of loss of control in flight leads to fatalities is a big number. And how do we reduce that? Well, one of the products in an SMS is that safety risk profile, and loss of control in flight should be mentioned. I'll also mention an info that just came out, safety info that just came out from the FAA on December 2nd. And it supersedes info 11011, which came out in May of 2011. This recent one, and a little background of it, and I'm going to read a part of it. In April 2024, the FAA published an update to Part 5. Everybody is aware of Part 5, in compliance to that. Now they're saying the requirement to Part 135, Part 91, 91K, and 91-147, which is the air tour, should comply. It's recommended they comply to having an SMS. And the documents are, as BJ mentioned, ICAO 9859 document, FAA Part 5, FAA AC 12092 Delta now, and they all describe what are the how to implement an SMS within your organization. And it also says, and it applies to turbojet aircraft operators, and any operators that have aircraft over 5,700 kilograms or 12,500 pounds to establish, recommended to establish an SMS. When I start working with clients, and it just happened in a couple of situations last month and this month, where before I go in and do a gap analysis, I ask them to send me their manuals. And I'm kind of drifting here, but I think it's important. When I read those manuals from these operators, from these clients, if I went in to do an audit without seeing anything else, they would pass because the manuals, whether they copied them from somebody else, they had a manual builder provider supply those to them, they would have passed FAA Part 5. It would have passed any type of standard that's out there as far as an audit is concerned. Once I got there, though, in peeling the layers off the onion, I realized, yes, they're not doing what they say they should be doing. And they thought that just having a manual would take care of that. So in reading this info, ICAO recommends that GA SMS include a process to identify actual and potential safety hazards and assess the associated risk. What that is the safety risk profile in my mind. Sitting down, analyzing the risks that you face, of which loss of control in flight should be there. And what is the mitigation to that? Well, the mitigation is UPRT. Because I've been through APS UPRT 3 times now, it's near and dear to my heart. And it teaches me something every time I go. And I also associate this for organizations to do an emergency response plan exercise. Because when an accident happens with an organization, it's a shock. You're startled. It takes you a while to recover and get your thoughts together, because it's chaotic, confusing, and very emotional. Same thing with loss of control in flight. I draw the comparison between the two situations. And when I do that, it kind of makes sense to them because I've done a lot of accident investigations, and with interviewing the folks within that organization, I always say, what did you feel like when that happened? How long did it take you to pick up your emergency response plan exercise or manual? And did it ground you? And the same thing applies to UPRT. If you've been through that, and for GA operators, they do unusual attitudes. They may have, in starting out, they may have done stalls, maybe gotten into a spin, for instance, so they know that. But it's the shock that you have to recover from. And if you've been through that training, it happens almost immediately. You're well trained, it's rote, and it's something that you can rely on. The other part of this is develop a process to develop and implement remedial action necessary to maintain an acceptable level of safety. And that also is your SRP and identifying loss of control in flight, along with safety performance indicators. These are all tools that are part of an SMS. So if you get into a situation where it's outside of that envelope that BJ was talking about, you've never been there before, okay, hopefully it's never going to happen again. But to prevent that from happening, there is the process of UPRT training, of which is an excellent way to train GA pilots. Military pilots like myself and some of the people that are probably listening, we've been upside down in an airplane. We understand what that envelope is. We understand human factor wise what that's going to do to us and how we react to that. And we're trained to take care of that. So with that, I'll open that up. BJ, if you want to open up to question and answers, that'd be great. I'd be more than happy to talk about that.
Well, I love that, Jim. That's really great perspective and all that. I like the way you tie in the safety risk profile and the safety performance indicators. It's interesting when you talked about an ERP. I was thinking that, very often ERP, we focus more on what the team does, which of course is exactly what it needs to be. But it's very interesting. We actually now look at the accident itself that generated the ERP. Well, how do you mitigate that risk? It may come later, but you identify essentially that, hey, this particular event happened because of a wake encounter. Well, the wake encounter is a hazard, but has an associated risk of loss of control. Well, how do we mitigate that again from not happening? And it's a whole process. And I think organizations really need the help of a safety auditor to really show them that process. And I really think make sure they don't miss any area in that ERP that they need to look at for risk mitigation. It's just not about what the team does on the ground. It's what generated this event in the first place. So thank you for sharing all that. I do want to bring up a couple of questions. Of course, our good friend Jeff Wofford is out there, and he always have great questions. We also have Joel Brown. I don't know if you know Joel at all, Jim, but he's from Canada. He was in the Canadian Armed Forces. I don't know if he knows DQ, one of our instructors. He was at BA Systems for a number of years, also with the Transport Canada, but now he's the president of Bullseye Aviation. So he has a great question here. Let me just pull up Joel's question. And so what do you see as the major differences or challenges between UPRT for commercial operators and UPRT for flight training units? So Jim, while you're thinking about that, let me just share with Joel a couple notes that I have here, if we don't get too much echoing. I think that when I look at that, I look at kind of at three levels. I look at the airline industry, I look at the business aviation industry, and then flight schools. And I think the airline industry is kind of fundamentally limited in the fact, while their subject matter experts can have comprehensive, robust, integrated training, they're really kind of restricted to really the simulator only. Now, done well, like we see with Delta Airlines, it can be very effective, but it's primarily in the reduction of probability, awareness, and prevention. I think the area of aviation has the most options is probably business aviation, corporate executive, and 135. Very often they have the ability of targeting the training that they need. And they can seek out, as Jim and his team did, and many hundreds of flight departments do, is looking for a program that's designed around what, where, and how they operate. So their programs can be designed, if they're jet operators, to have jet training to ensure they're not just doing on-aircraft training, but integrated simulator training, or just not doing sim, but integrating on aircraft. The flight school is a little bit different. We've seen that. We have a location in Europe, and it was mandated in Europe to do on-aircraft training. And it really was a little bit of a disaster. What I mean by that was there was so much downward pressure on time, price, and instructional quality. What ended up happening is they're using non-aerobatic airplanes to essentially do what they were doing before with instructors that don't really understand kind of the modern approach to UPRT, and they just simply stuck a label of UPRT on it. So it shouldn't be surprising that there's going to be little or no difference there. Now, however, APS is lucky. We train the United Aviate Academy, and we consider them the gold standard of flight school training, and they do an integrated program. They come to us from Goodyear. They're here for 2 days. They go through 4 training sessions, 3 on aircraft, an integrated simulator session, and it's very, very powerful. But again, they're limited on time. They're always budget constrained. But I think for progressive organizations, they find a way to afford it within the design of their program, because understanding the fatality and the lethality of loss of control, but also the tremendous power and competency it gives to pilots across their flight operation and how they fly airplanes just differently with more competency and more awareness, it's really well worth the investment to do it. So the biggest difference is really, I believe, is what's realistic for that operator. Airlines limited to simulate. Business aviation has the most options, and flight schools are really beholden to their decision makers having the wherewithal and an understanding of the risks to make good decisions. Most flight schools try to do it on their own with the resources they have and the instructors that they have, which is essentially just not really doing anything. That approach is what established loss of control as the number one threat and will perpetuate it. So Jim, do you have any thoughts on Joel's question, maybe looking at it from a different perspective that you'd like to add on that?
No, I think you covered it, BJ. It's something that needs to be evaluated for sure, no matter what type of operation you have, commercial, corporate, training organizations. It applies to everybody.
Awesome. Okay, let's bring Jeff's question up. But what percentage of corporate operators are participating in some kind of UPRT program? So maybe, Jim, that's a great question for you. Maybe with your exposure to the industry and your customers, and you don't have to share how many customers you have, but maybe when you go out into a new market, what percentage would you guess do you think are going through a UPRT program? I know how many we train, and I know what the overall addressable market is, but very often they're doing something or just counting on their type rating and recurrent training to address it effectively and call it done. So Jim, do you maybe want to give thoughts on that? Because I think not all UPRT is the same for sure.
No, that's true. And when I interact with my clients and we talk about UPRT, loss control in flight and UPRT, some will say, well, we do that in a simulator. Okay, that's fine. It's not the same as being in the aircraft, however, and we talk about that. Percentage-wise, I think it's a relatively low percentage because in every case, when I'm working with a client, when I bring that up, no, we haven't done that. We've thought about it, but we haven't done it yet. Why haven't you done it? Doesn't it make sense after we get into that discussion? And in the end, they all agree. Now, and then I get into the referral to APS. It's saying, let me introduce these folks to you, take it from there, and see what that leads to. Hopefully they take you up on it. But I will say, and you talked about that, the last from Joel Brown is there's financial considerations. There's time considerations. Do they want to commit, especially if they're a small Part 91 operator, for instance, one airplane, 3 or 4 people, can they spend the time to get away to do that training? Well, my response to that is always, you spend the time to go through initial and recurrent training. Isn't it sort of like the same thing?
Yeah.
And it leads to more discussion about that. But my experience is that I can't give you a number, but it's a low percentage of operators that have gone through that, that training, that process.
Yeah, and I think the way that we approach that, Jim, is that many, many years ago, we had to make a decision. Do we want to offer a one flight, 1 day program or couple day program and increase our customer base to train everybody, but not really mitigate the risk? And we decided not to. We decided we're only going to deliver training at APS that actually saves lives. And that requires a number of days, at least for initial training. Recurrent training can be done in a day, but for initial training, you need a full 3 days. You need integrated, you need on aircraft, you need simulation, you need an expert instructor, all the things that the Every Piloted Control Solution Standard talks about. And so what we have found is that we have a lot of people reaching out to us, but they don't like our answer on what it takes. And we just made a decision a number of years ago is while we want to help everybody, we are unable to help people that are unwilling to take the necessary steps to overcome this risk because it's so dominant for a reason. It is largely ineffectively mitigated by the current system. To address it, it doesn't take a long time, but it takes intensity. It takes a number of days to do it. So I would guess, my estimate would be is about less than 5% of the overall marketplace actually pursues something beyond the regulatory minimums. That's what we see. And I'm not saying coming to APS, I'm saying going anywhere, giving some kind of unique attention to UPRT in some way. So I think that Part 5 SMS, Jim, could help that because you and I and John have talked about the 135 exemption opportunity. I think once 135 operators go down that path, there is a way of doing this at low or no cost or cost savings, but that's really probably not going to be a reality for a year or two from now when it becomes mandated, where they have to your point, not just say what they're doing, but demonstrate they're doing what they say they're going to do, right? Anything else to add on that?
If an organization has a fully developed SMS, which is robust, has all of the components, and they're following that, they're religious about that, their insurance companies could possibly help out with programs like this. So I just thought I'd mention that as well. And I know a lot of operators are aware of that. So just another aspect of UPRT.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think Pablo has a good question here. Do you know if there any expectation to update the airplane upset prevention and recovery training aid? 2017 is it? I don't know. It's a great resource. So maybe, Pablo, a little bit of history there. It used to be Boeing and Airbus leading that from the late 90s. They started with the first version of the airplane upset recovery training aid. They had 2 revisions of that, and then the what is called revision 3 is actually a different variant that included a lot of information on prevention. So if you're using those resources, it's important to understand that the airplane upset prevention recovery training aid revision 3 is not a replacement for revision 2. Revision 2 has a lot of information that's really critical, and I still believe the FAA only recognizes revision 2 as a resource. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater by ignoring revision 2. Now, your other question there, Pablo, as well, is there any AC update? Well, the advisory circulars for the FAA are excellent. They're in alignment with ICAO Doc 111 that Jim mentioned, the manual on airplane upset prevention and recovery training. They're really excellent at detailing what to do. They don't go into much or any detail on how to do it. But when it comes to the resources of the FAA, they are truly excellent. And I high-five the regulators for what they've done. AC 12111, which is getting updated. I think it's update 1 or revision 1 now. 12111 is upset prevention and recovery training. AC 12109A is stall prevention and recovery training. And while they are separate, it is recognized that a stall is a subset of an airplane upset, but they're separated because there's templates that they have for how to address those. Pablo, if you're not familiar with the most recent one, which is AC 120-123 flight path management, that is really a fantastic resource by the FAA, which really doubles down on awareness and prevention, managing the flight path and the strategies. And the Flight Safety Foundation has a great resource as well on flight path management. So I believe there's a lot of great resources. In our judgment, having been doing this for 30 years, the regulatory guidance is excellent. What's missing is the how. And what's missing is the expert instructors. What's missing is the commitment and dedication to the amount of time and intensity required to mitigate the risk. And that's really up, unfortunately, to individual flight departments. Sadly, based on our experience that we had in Europe, I don't know that mandating it is the right solution, because it just makes it status quo. And since there's such unique expertise required to teach that, I just feel there's going to be a false sense of security. But, we will always represent the industry, and we will always present solutions that align with its guidance. Always. We always have, and we always will. And as I said before, an effective UPRT program has to, first and foremost, as a minimum, meet regulatory requirements, but should integrate best practices and should integrate all the 5 critical components we mentioned, the Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard. Jim, anything to add to that? Maybe you could re-mention the SAFO that just came out, because it does relate to Pablo's question to some extent. I'm going to bring up his other one right here.
Yeah, it's the one that just came out is SAFO 24014, and you can read all about that. It's not very long, but it has to do with SMS and establishing that and what the FAA requires. There's some processes that you can go through. It's the FAA voluntary SMS program. That's number one. You can have a third party, and they mention having a third party come in and do an audit for you. But eventually it comes down to fully establish your SMS, which of which should be loss of control and flight mitigations. You can do a declaration of compliance with the FAA, not for 91 yet. Once the mandate, the regulation comes down for, this is just an info, by the way. Once the regulation comes down for 91, 145, just about everybody. And if you listen, I'm going to back up here. If you listen to the folks on the board of NTSB, some of which are close friends of ours, they will tell you that they would like every part of the FAA regulations to have a fully functioning SMS. Everybody. So from the OEMs, the 130, the 135, 133, 137, 107, soon to be 108, that's the drones, oil and gas, utilities, law enforcement, everybody should have an SMS. That's how you're going to prevent incidents and accidents. That's how we're going to drive the tragic things that could happen down to the lowest common denominator. But this info kind of explains it. Again, it's not very long, but they do refer to AC 12092 Delta now, that came out earlier this year. All of the annexes of ICAO, including Annex 19, which is safety management, ICAO document 9859, which is safety management systems, SMS, Part 5, all of them. So the more you are in knowledge of these regulations, these guidance, the guidance and the standards, the better off you'll be on developing a fully functioning SMS. There's a lot of operators that have done that already, and they are well ahead of the curve.
And I think, for us, there is a common perception, if I just get this manual and put it on my shelf, I'm safer. It's all about the execution. It's all about having an active team, an active SMS where there's reporting going on and mitigating risk. It's really all about the devil's in the details. And so it really is about taking action. I just brought up Pablo's post here. Congratulations, Pablo. It's great to hear that you all are getting an expanded UPRT program. That's wonderful. That's about the length of time that Delta Airlines did it. I think the only concern would be, while the simulators can be modified, certainly there's Part 60 changes when it comes to the FAA, but there's also ICAO regulation on modifying simulators for UPRT. That is by far not nearly as important as the qualified instructors. So you can have a program that can teach really, really effective, transferable, life-saving skills or not, fundamentally hinging on the instructors and how they're teaching the program. So, speak to your company about that. If they've gone out and their instructors have had specialized training, that's wonderful. That's what you want. But if they haven't, that's usually going to get repackaged into what they were doing before under a different name. So just be careful. I congratulate your airline in investing in that. I really, really do. It's fantastic, but it takes the exact same amount of time to do it right and do it wrong. So please, continue to work towards doing it right. And maybe you are, and if you are, it's fantastic. It's wonderful to see. There's just so many great advances going on in the industry. And so with that, Jim, I would like to thank everybody that is joining us live. Most of the people that join are on demand because we have a worldwide audience. They show up afterwards to watch the replay. So we get hundreds and hundreds of views here over the next few days of these events, which is going to be really, really exciting. But I thank everybody for being here who's live and those of you watching the replay. And Jim, thank you so much for being here and bringing your expertise. It's really immensely valuable. And we just love partnering with our safety auditors. And you are one of 4 auditors we partner with and just a real champion of safety and saving lives. So thank you for everything you do, Jim.
Happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Okay, everybody, we are going to sign off for today. We look forward to the next event. And next week, it's going to be on human factors. We look forward to seeing you then. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.